The United States Army invaded Europe in 1944 and never left. America's forward projection of its military was instrumental in the stabilization of Europe and the establishment of the world order that's existed since the end of World War II. A critical piece of American power is U.S. Army Europe Africa, a command responsible for over 37,000 soldiers, 104 countries, 10 units, and 9 garrisons. Over 70,000 U.S. military personnel operate across Europe and Africa in either permanent positions or deployed in support of national security objectives. To explain why U.S. Army Europe Africa is so important, I sat down with Command Sergeant Major Jeremiah Inman, the command's senior enlisted advisor. Sergeant Major Inman breaks down the command's mission to deter aggression and provide stability in some of the world's most complicated and dynamic regions. He explains the magnitude of the command's responsibilities, and also shares his biggest leadership lessons learned from his time in Ranger Regiment and how they prepared him to lead no matter the challenge. Join our conversation from the bunkers of Pointe Du Hoc in Normandy, France. Follow us on social media, read the full episode on our website, then head over to our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform for all our D-Day coverage, including our first documentary, Unknown Heroes Behind Enemy Lines at D-Day, the story of Operation Jedburgh. Sergeant Major, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
We're literally in a gun bunker at Pointe Du Hoc.
Roger that.
We made you walk through the field, but I told you it was going to be worth it because just over our heads over here is the cliff. And the cliff that these Rangers 80 years ago scaled on the morning of June 6, 1944, which is tomorrow morning.
Sure. Yeah, walking through the field made me feel like a real soldier, so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to not sit behind a desk.
I was reminding you of the other days, but I think one of the most amazing parts about walking through this is the craters are still there.
Right.
From all the bombardment that we had, and then the heroism of those guys as they scaled those 90-foot cliffs and then took this area. It's so impactful.
Yeah, going to protect people who can't help themselves. It's a great honor to do that.
So one of the biggest, I think, parts of our military lineage, past and present, was something that started 80 years ago with D-Day, and then with the continued advance into Europe, right, and then the culmination of World War II. But that's America's forward deployed U.S. Army presence. You're the Command Sergeant Major for U.S. Army Europe and Africa, two very different geographical combatant commands, two very different geographical areas, two areas where I had the fortunate opportunity to serve. But there's also a tremendous amount of responsibility in there. Can you talk for a minute about the mission of U.S. Army Europe Africa and why that forward positioning of our Army forces has been a staple of the strategic U.S. national security policy for the last 80 years?
Sure, they are quite different environments. So our mission sets for the continent of Africa, continent of Europe are different, right? Eisenhower had the foresight to leave forces in Europe in the event something would happen again. And that's kind of what's going on right now. Primary mission is to deter, but if necessary, defeat, enemies.
Mm-hmm. When we look at the force structure that's still in Europe, specific to the Army, I mean, we've got Belgium, Germany. I was doing the math this morning, and the website's showing 42 different installations of some sort, whether that be a base or a housing installation across Germany. I mean, that's massive. Italy, Poland, Black Sea, Balkans, 41,000 soldiers. I mean, that's an incredible presence that we've maintained. When you look across that force structure, what's your guidance and what's your vision for them every day?
Our vision is to get up, show up, and be ready to assist our partners, continue to train and maintain that combat readiness in the event we do have to get into something.
One of the most important, I would say, activities that U.S. Army Europe Africa is a part of is the exercises. And there's exercises, and we think about African Lion, we think about the NATO Joint Force exercises that occur. Can you talk about the importance of those exercises and what the objective of them is?
We are a learning organization, and we've learned over the years that we're not going to fight alone, right? So if we can continue to train and work with our allies and partners now, when we do have to fight, we'll already have those sets and reps and be a much more lethal force.
Yeah. Talk about the differences between Europe and Africa.
So Africa's great, right? 54 countries. We cover down on 53 of them.
Unless there's a coup on a certain day and maybe
We may
one
have
more or one
had a
less.
couple of those over the last few years, but they weren't our fault. I just want to make sure that's clear. But you did talk about African lion, right? So that's 5 different countries in Africa, 27 partner nations involved with this exercise. Some things I can't actually mention, but we've never done them before, but we were able to do. And this time we included NATO, right? So we're starting to get, humans drew the boundaries, but there's no boundaries in terrorism, or evil. So that was probably the best African lion we've had since we began the process.
Yeah. Well, and I think you just said it there. And when we think about Africa and we think about the enemy in Africa, we do think a lot about terrorism. Yet when we talk about Europe, we never thought until a couple of years ago that we may see another land war in Europe. And here we are today with the Russian incursion into Ukraine,
Sure.
but it's several years later, and that's still going on. And front and center is U.S. Army Europe Africa as part of that fight and the enablement of getting and preparing the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves. But that's a very different enemy, and that takes a lot of different training and a lot of different skill set and often weaponry to be able to do that. How is U.S. Army Europe Africa preparing the forces and kind of having that conversation about, hey, we've got 2 very different enemies, but we got to prepare the same forces?
Right. I think if we go back a few years, Russia went into Georgia uninvited, right? And in 2014, they went into the Ukraine uninvited and annexed Crimea. So this war isn't just 2 years old. This has been going on for years. And we've developed a partnership with the Ukrainians back in 2014 to start training them in Lviv in Ukraine. And then when the war kicked out, we brought them over to Grafenwehr to continue the training. Because if you look at their forces, the majority of the folks leading platoons are sergeants.
Mm-hmm.
That's their fighting force right now. So we've been able to develop this relationship over years of partnership to assist them with what they're dealing with right now.
Well, let's talk about the sergeants and the NCO Corps. We know, and as an American military structure, in any of the components, that our NCO Corps is what separates us from every other nation in the world. When we talk about the development of the next generation of NCOs, the post-GWAT generation of NCOs, what are you looking for?
They're crushing it. Just like every generation before, they've stood up and accepted the fight. That the young NCOs now are so much smarter than I will ever be. Innovation, thinking outside the box to do certain things, setting up their own 3D printers to make stuff. I mean, they're phenomenal leaders, phenomenal. Our NCO development's gotten a lot better over the years, right? Our courses have improved with stuff. And now we're bringing our partners in to attend a lot of our courses as well. I went to the Sergeant Major's Academy a couple of weeks ago, and I ran into a Malawian female.
Mm-hmm.
I met her in 2017. Now she's going through our academy and going back to Malawi to be a Sergeant Major Academy instructor in her country.
And so we talk about the enablement and passing those skills on. I mean, I'm an SF guy, so our whole idea is how do we train others to solve their own problems in the future?
The big part of it too is we're only empowered if our officers empower us, right? If they're going to hold us back and not let us assist, then we can't assist. And we're seeing that in some places, but it's getting so much better. I held a conference of European armies, NCOs, in Albania a couple of weeks ago. Fully stood up, ran, led, educated conference. And I met with the CHOD, I met with the Land Forces commander, and they let Sergeant Major run everything. It was really good to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's the advancement. When we talk about advancing our partners, I think that's one of the critical components. There's 4 lines of effort at U.S. Army Africa, Europe, and I want to ask you about them, kind of define them a little bit. The first one is set the theater. What do we mean by set the theater?
Go into a place, get it set up for follow-on troops if we have to do something. Mm-hmm. If you remember a few years back in Liberia, they had Ebola breakout.
Mm-hmm.
So CTAF, which is, one of our subordinate commands, went down to Liberia. General Williams was actually the commander, set up the theater to bring in medical assistance, training, and that's what set the theater basically means.
Mm-hmm. The second one is combat credible forces for 2 GCCs.
Yeah, it's really more than that. I think we're supporting PACOM and CENTCOM as well at this time. But it's just continuing to train. We're bringing the rotational forces over for 9 months. They train extremely hard. They have time to do expert training. They have time to go to JMRC and run through our CTC to do simulated combat operations. Few things we've done too is 4-2. Striker Squadron from 4-2, drove from Grafenwehr to Poland to conduct a multinational live fire exercise.
It's a long drive.
It was awesome. We've also had our fires folks drive from Grafenwehr to Estonia to do the first SHORAD live fire.
Huh. A lot of road clearances involved in that one, huh?
Yes, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot over the past 2 years.
Number 3 is interoperability with allies and partners.
And, like I mentioned earlier, just getting to know the people you're going to fight with later. We're never, ever going to fight by ourselves again. The last couple of commands that I've been in, a lot of our planners are Australian or Austrian or Turkish. It's a team effort to fight, combat.
How important are those relationships? Because one of the force multipliers I think that we have in the special forces community is the fact that we build these relationships all over the world with indigenous forces. And as our NCOs and our officers progress in their career, well, so do their counterparts.
Right.
And so when you're a lieutenant and you're working in a foreign country with another lieutenant or a sergeant, and then one day you're a general, they're a sergeant major, how important is that trust that's built?
I think if you look at my boss, right, General Williams, he did the G3 job here. He did CTAF in Africa for 2 years. He went to NATO Land Forces and did Land Forces Commander, and he's back. And he still knows a lot of these people. So those relationships are super important.
Yeah. Well, it's trust. It builds that trust.
Yeah.
The last line of effort is modernize the force, and that's something we've been talking with all the commanders and sergeant majors across different regions of the Army and different departments even.
Right.
And we talked a lot about it with the sergeant major of the Army as well a few weeks ago. How do we modernize rapidly, and what are we modernizing to?
That's a very good question. Modernizing to the future fight is where we're trying to get after, right? I talked earlier about the young NCOs and soldiers with their 3D printers being very innovative and coming up with solutions to fix problems. We bought a lot of off-the-shelf stuff. If you get to spend any time with 2CR, they've got some pretty good products that they've been developing and using. A lot of electric type activities. But I think that's how we're going to get after, modernizing the force.
How do you define the next fight?
We just got to be ready for anything. Because you don't know what the next fight is, I didn't see myself going back to Afghanistan for 20 months. I thought I was done with that, right? But, life gets a vote.
Yeah.
You
were the sergeant major at JRTC.
Yes.
And a lot of the component commanders have put a renewed emphasis on the CTCs and the combat training centers and the importance of them, and how do we really get our forces of all forces, not just conventional forces, because often we think about NTC and we're like, well, that's where 4th ID goes. I mean, I was in 4th ID,
sure,
so I remember going there. It was August, and you couldn't touch the Bradley, but those centers have advanced so tremendously over the last 10, 15 years. Talk about the importance of the CTCs and how they're being leveraged across the Army to prepare for that next fight.
That's a great question as well, because we also use the Center for Army Lessons Learned, capturing all the stuff that's going on with us, in our current theater of operations. We started bringing in drones, purchasing off-the-shelf drones and giving them to Geronimo to go attack the conventional forces to see how they reacted to it.
Yeah.
And they, of course, obviously started to adapt to it after we crashed about 15 of those things. So
here we go.
Couple of C-130s.
That's great timing.
Yeah, it's perfect. Just need a few folks to jump on them and we'll be all set.
It's awesome. Four is off the coast.
And the other thing about the CTCs, if a unit's doing really well, we can turn it up a little bit, right, to make it a little more challenging. If they're not doing as well, we can turn it down a little bit to adjust their learning process.
How quickly are we taking what we're seeing happen out in theater and then converting that back into the training?
Months. Yeah, we had a dedicated team here to help wrap that stuff up. I think they do 2 CTC conferences a year, and our team's going over and helping assist with, adjusting the fight, the fake fight, so units can get stronger.
Yeah. One of the biggest topics that we talk about with leaders across the Army specifically is the relationship between special forces, special operations, we'll broaden it and say special operations, and the conventional force. You've served in both. You served in Ranger Regiment in 175, and then you've served a bulk of your career in the conventional forces. Talk about the relationship between the two and how when we look at the next fight, we look at the peer-to-peer fight, it's different than the counterterrorism fight was. Right. And the ability for SOF to work cohesively with the conventional force is more critical now than ever.
Absolutely. You probably dealt with that early off in GWAT. We were pretty separate, right? And we didn't talk to each other until you needed assistance in a QRF.
Yeah, that was about it.
Or we found some bad person we couldn't technically go get, right? So establishing L&Os in the cells, coming together at the first meeting, not 10 meetings into a planning process, to make sure everybody's dialed in tight. They've gotten a lot closer.
What's your lessons learned?
Lessons learned.
You've served at every level of command, and you have a tremendous remit right now. And you said that there's a younger generation who's bright, they're motivated, they're ready to get after it, but you're the guy they're looking up to. So what's your wisdom that you're imparting in them after your career?
How much time do we have? Been in the Army like 37 years, so I've probably forgotten more than I've learned. But no, I'd share something. So Colonel Ralph Puckett recently passed, and while I was at the infantry school sergeant majors, we had a lot of discussions about Ranger School, and gender integration. And the folks are arguing in the room about it, and Ralph Puckett's like, I didn't go to Ranger School to be better than the next guy. I went to Ranger School to be better than myself. So I wish I would have learned that as a young private, and I probably would have been a lot better soldier and sergeant major. The other piece of advice is like, when you show up. Be present, get after it, 100%, and then some.
All right, test question. Last question.
No math?
No math. Well, we've just got to count to 3, but I'll do the counting. Habits form the foundation of success, right? When we look at successful people, whether they're in the military, they're in government, they built a business, you name it, they always come back to their habits. I always tie this question back to the Jedburghs of World War II. They had to do 3 things that you're very familiar with. That they had to be able to shoot, move, and communicate at a proficient level, so that when they parachuted in starting the night of June 5th, 1944, and then linked up with French resistance, they didn't have to think about, how do I use my rifle? How do I communicate on my radio? How do I move through night? They focused their attention on the complex task of disrupting the Germans' ability to reinforce these beaches. What are the 3 things that you do every day to set the conditions for success in your world?
That is a totally loaded question. If I could just go back to 1988, showing up in Ranger Regiment, right? And we had the big 4. Physical training, marksmanship, battle drills, and medical training. And then we added, developing leaders of character. I think that's kind of how I've grown my entire career, is after those 5 aspects, right? So you got to be fit enough to get to, through, and beyond the objective, right? You got to be a good marksman, right? So you can kill the enemy right away. You need to understand the battle drills. In the event a leader above you goes down, you need to be able to take that squad or that platoon to continue the mission, right? And then medical training. You need to be able to fix yourself so your brothers can fight, or be able to assist a fallen comrade. And then, of course, leaders of character, right? That's what we need to get after.
Remain physically fit, be a good marksman, be able to medically take care of yourself and your buddies, know your battle drills so you know what you got to do when the time comes, and be a person of character.
Absolutely.
I think all leadership starts and ends with character too.
Yeah.
I agree with you there.
I think we had the opportunity to meet the veterans coming off the airplane the other day. And you talk about character, right? You talk about why it's important for us to come back and do this remembrance every day or every year. I've got a great uncle buried in Lorraine Cemetery.
Wow.
I was able to find him a couple of years ago. I brought my dad over, and he was able to go pay respects to his uncle, right? Because if we forget this, something terrible can happen again. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a sacred place. We got to remember it. Well, Sergeant Major, I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Fran. Appreciate
you.
Thanks.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast, an official program of the Green Beret Foundation. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other long and short form content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow the Jedburgh Podcast and the Green Beret Foundation on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X, or Threads. Send your comments and inquiries to fran@jedburghpodcast.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Media Channel and the Green Beret Foundation remain committed to supporting all generations of U.S. Army Special Forces and their families. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.